Hello, good evening, and welcome to another live stream here on Hedgehogs Hollow. And this evening, I'm really excited for our guest. Joel Ashton is joining me from Wild Your Garden. It's going to be really exciting. Joel is a veteran. I'm actually going to just bring him in. Joel, a veteran of doing your own live streams, actually. Joel, welcome to Hedgehogs Hollow.
Hi, Mike. Yeah, thanks very much for having me. Pleasure to join you.
No. You're very welcome, but you've been doing live streams with your own channel for quite some time, and that seemed to go really well for you. That was really popular.
Yeah, fantastic. I think there's a growing need for everybody to have an online kind of go-to place for any questions to do, a bit like what you're doing with the Hedgehogs, Mike. Really, just where there is a constant presence where someone can just fire off questions. No doubt you get asked a lot yourself, where it's just stuff that is very hard to get an answer from Google a lot of the time.
Joel, you are Essex way, aren't you?
Yes, unfortunately for my sins these days. And I'm only joking. Yes, amazing how a woman can change your life, isn't it? No, I've been in Essex now a couple of years, and to be honest, it's rather convenient for a lot of the work I do is kind of in the south these days. Still go up to Yorkshire. I've got jobs to look at in Scotland, projects. Well, I've got to go to Wales shortly. I was in Devon a couple of weeks back, so I still get all over the place. But it's quite handy to be in the south.
Joel, I must actually, we could continue talking about gardening because I know it's your passion, but the other passion you've got is wildlife, and I know you're here to talk hedgehogs and gardening, but you've got real passion for both gardening, which has become your commercial enterprise, and wildlife, which actually you've kind of mixed into that commercial enterprise as well. So which came first? The passion for gardening or the passion for wildlife?
Well, it was the wildlife first and foremost. That was back in the year dot, it feels like now, when since I was kind of knee high to a grasshopper, I was always fascinated by, well, I think it started with birds, to be honest, because they were the most accessible, and it was great. I had great fun. I had one of the original, well, I say one of the original, probably a 90s version of the Collins Guide to British Birds, which was held together by a sellotape after a few years, and is still knocking around somewhere around the house. But I just read that religiously to, cover to cover, just, on all the different species of birds, and just was fascinated to the point where, I do a lot of design, obviously, nowadays for all the gardens that I install. And so art has always been a big part of my life. I've always enjoyed drawing. Not that I get much time these days, but so I've always had that kind of side to I love that side. And so I would spend hours meticulously drawing avocet heads, lapwing heads, crossbill heads, anything that had a unique beak. I remember doing an A3 drawing of all the different sort of interesting bird hedges I could find in the book. So that I think birds really kicked it off for me in the beginning. And then, I sort of went on from there. Once I then learned that actually there were 58 resident species of butterfly in the UK, and that there was actually a bright green one called the green hairstreak, which just blew my mind. It was like something that had come out of the Amazon, that sort of opened up the world of butterflies for me, which is obviously a huge passion of mine. And I really kind of just had a huge respect then for these amazing insects. I think that they go through this entire year's worth of life cycle, trying to avoid being eaten by absolutely everything, parasitized, eaten, squashed, mown, from the egg right the way through to the pupa, of course, for 9, 10, 11 months sometimes, to then emerge as this incredibly detailed little thing, which is then around for a couple of weeks at best a lot of the time. So it was fascinating. Then when you start learning about the life cycles of these things, what they are specifically breeding on in terms of a wildflower, the exact habitat they have to have Things like the large, won't digress too much, but the large blue, for example, you know, the large blue butterfly is obviously once extinct, then reintroduced back into the UK, has a massive symbiosis with yellow meadow ants, which actually carry the pupa into the ants' nests to overwinter, and the pupa actually give off, you know, the right kind of noises and pheromones so that the ants believe they are protecting one of their larvae. And then this butterfly kind of emerges in the spring, crawls out of the ant nest, and thanks very much for the protection, you know. And so it's stuff like that, and that's very extreme. But, you know, I was just enthralled by their beauty, really. So, but that definitely came first. The landscaping then started in 2005 when I started the business. And I very soon learned that, you know, wasn't content with all the years of watching wildlife with just building patios, fences, and laying turf. I wanted to do much more and realized I had the opportunity to be able to physically install habitats for wildlife. So that's obviously all the, you know, the meadows, the ponds, and everything else, and integrate that into a garden in a way that I think had only really been done by Chris Baines previously back in the 80s. And obviously he made the first. He was like the godfather, you know. He invented wildlife gardening, really, and brought it to a stage that people, I don't think people were ready for that stage at the time, you know. It says it all when his gold medal that he won at Chelsea for his wildlife garden was so that the judges couldn't get their head around it at the time. So they actually, on his medal, he got imprinted Chris Baines for his wildfire garden, because the term or the phrase wildlife garden just to them was incomprehensible. So, you know, that was, unfortunately, Chris, I think, was a little before his time in the sense that nowadays we're all, you know, senses are heightened. We're all aware of you know, climate change, insect declines, and everything else. So we're all, I think, a lot more aware, and particularly with social media, of course, as to how we need to be doing our bit and living more economically friendly.
Now, I wanted to ask you, across that 15-year, and I think you've kind of answered it there, but across that 15, 16 years of doing the landscaping, have you noticed the change in kind of public appetite for wildlife gardens? Whereas, you, like you say, right now on social media, there seems like a lot of wildlife gardening kind of topics and hashtags. There's a lot of the rewilding type hashtag going around, and that seems a really popular topic. But 15, 16 years ago, it maybe have even been a struggle for you to get your business going. Have you seen a change in kind of public appetite for wildlife gardening in that time?
Oh, massively so, yeah. I mean, I think it's been helped a lot by programs such as Springwatch, obviously, that started back in the early 2000s, and even Gardeners World. I mean, so one of the gardens that I did was featured on Gardeners World 2 or 3 years ago, and I think that was a big eye-opener for a lot of people. But also now you see Monty Dunn talking about, you know, not mowing the edges of the garden, you know, which if you'd have said 20 years ago, 25 years ago, would have been, you know, sort of kicked out the ballpark. You know, people wouldn't have been comprehended it, because it was mown lawns and, you know, rose borders and everything else. And things have changed. Things have definitely changed, and I've seen a massive increase, you know, in terms of inquiries and, you know, but generally perceptions of how to garden have changed. I think, you know, at the end of the day, you know, I've got 2 kids myself. I don't have a huge garden, but we don't have a lawn here. It's just meadow and pond, and, you know, the kids aren't left desiring anything through not having some mown lawn. You know, if they want to run around, we go down the park, we go down the fields, I take them to the seawall down here to the marshes. They don't go without. And I think it's one of my biggest problems that I face is actually changing perceptions with a lot of people as to why it's okay to not have, you know, trimmed edges to your lawn, why it's okay to have a wildlife pond in the centre of your garden rather than shoved away in the back corner of the garden. So, but attitudes are definitely changing. You know, when I first started, I was having to almost hold people at knife point to put a bird box up. Now it's part and parcel of every job that I do. You know,
so you're doing, Yeah, and you've recently, I say recently, but last year you've kind of taken that even one step further. But there's now the Wild Your Garden book that you released. I think yourself and your brother released that, which is doing really, really well, and that's kind of unique in itself, because I believe that has whole lists of kind of, if you're looking for native plants, here are all the native plants, here are the things that you can do. That's really quite kind of, I don't want to say prescriptive, but it really does give you all the information you possibly could want, kind of walking you stage by stage how to make a wildlife pond, what the plants are, and it's all kind of specifically, like we've been saying, wildlife focused, and it kind of feeds into that, doesn't it? What was the inspiration for the book?
Well, I mean, actually, I was in the very humble position where Dorling Kindersley contacted me to say, would you write a book for us? You know, we feel there's a gap in the market. And this was off the back of the Gardener's World episode that featured one of the gardens. And it was really a kind of a shockwave that kind of then carried on for quite some time. And I'm still kind of, a bit amazed at the speed in which things have traveled over the last couple of years. And so the book was, a kind of a byproduct of the Gardener's World Live. The editor actually contacted us directly and said, look, seen you on Gardener's World, would you write the book? There's a big gap in the market. So obviously, jumped at the chance, especially with somebody like Dorling Kindersley. So it was wonderful. Here is the actual version in real life, Mike, if you're interested.
Oh, you beat me to it.
Beat it.
Look at that.
You're absolutely right. And my favourite bit of the book is, I can't tell you how often I reference this section of the book, is all the plant list, which is just for me, show you.
Yeah.
That's everything from the, all the native wildflowers, trees, shrubs, herbaceous perennials that are good for pollinators, which, somebody like the RHS has online on their website, a lot of the herbaceous stuff and everything else. But I think it's very, very important, the amount of people that have got in touch to say, I've read your book, now because of it, I'm going to do this, that, and the other. And on the back of the book, I noticed there was a huge gap, of course, the next question was, where can I get all these products? So the people were getting in touch, they were seeing the YouTube videos, they were seeing the how to make a wildlife pond, they were reading the book, but they were saying, right, I know where to put it, I know how to do one now, but where do I get this stuff for it? And so that's when wildyourgarden.com was obviously released on the 1st of April this year as an online one-stop shop, which is constantly evolving. It's constantly, adding new stuff all the time. So I think, the main thought process for me behind all of this was that, to have the 3 items. So you've got the how-tos in terms of the YouTube, you've got the book in terms of the theory behind everything, and then you've got the online shop where people can buy. So this is actually, it's okay me preaching about wildlife ponds and wildflower meadows and everything else, but I can only get to so many places in a year. I can't get to everyone, and equally, not everybody has a budget to spend on a garden at the minute. These are very difficult times, of course. So where I can, rest knowing that I've helped create more habitats because of one of the videos, but I think it's fantastic to be able to do that, and that is, of course, the main point in all of this. The whole point for me starting the YouTube channel, a lot of the reasoning behind the book, and of course the main reason behind the wildyourgarden.com online shop, just to try and help create as many habitats as possible, because they are diminishing, unfortunately, in the wider countryside. Wildflower meadows down 97% over the last century. Wildlife ponds have lost over 1 million of them over the last century. So, we need to do a lot more than we're doing. But hey, if we can inspire more people, it helps. You've
also done your fair share, because recently you clocked up 10 acres worth of wild meadow seeding, I believe. I don't know if that's the right term, seeding of wild meadows. But you clocked up a total area of 10 acres, which is remarkable.
Well, I mean, it's not actually a massive area. If you were to walk to your local park, you've probably got 2, 3, 4, 5 acres of parkland. So you might think, well, that's only 2 or 3 jobs. But a lot of that percentage is obviously broken up into small gardens where it might be 30 to a couple of 100 square meters. So, it took a little bit of time, but adding all those sections up, and, and I've just had sort of half acre to that yesterday. So, you know, it's nice to be able to think back now, and I'm not going to stop at this point by any means, but to know that there are 10 more acres of wildflower meadow around the UK, which is wonderful, and you know, long may it continue. I have no intentions of stopping now.
Just to Sue's just asked, what's the online shop website address? So just before we move on, what is the online shop website address, Joel?
It's just simply wildyourgarden.com. So yeah, it's wildyourgarden.com. So
brilliant.
Hopefully
I'll also add it later to the video description to make sure it's there. But we're talking about wildlife, and specifically kind of focusing on hedgehogs. Now, I know that you've also done a couple of videos on your YouTube about hedgehogs, and this one that I'm showing at the moment is all about putting a hedgehog hole into a fence. That you were doing the design for the garden, weren't you? And you actually are now adding, this is how you're going to add the hole into the fence, and kind of walks you through the process. How often do you end up with these types of decisions being able to influence your clients in terms of kind of broadening their horizon? Maybe they wanted a wildlife pond, but you're actually delivering something beyond just the pond. You're going to add a hedgehog hole, for example.
Well, I mean, it's kind of fundamental in the design process, and there's certain elements, obviously, whenever I visit a garden, you know, I always look at what wildlife can enter it. You know, there's no point designing fantastic herbaceous borders that are going to be filled with lots of cover and insects and food for hedgehogs if they can't access it. So absolutely right. You know, access is the main thing. Yeah, foxes, obviously, it's not a problem because they can jump scale 6-7 foot walls, no problem at all. But hedgehogs, of course, they are very, very restricted in terms of where they can get, and obviously they need that 12.5 centimeter hole, don't they? You know, sort of 5 to 6 inches in diameter to actually get into a garden. So the job that I've been doing in North London recently, you might have seen one or two of the videos on that. I'm specifically designing the trellis fencing. We're speaking to both neighbours, both obviously very keen in attracting wildlife, which is great. Not always the case, unfortunately. But we are designing the trellis fencing so that there is a gap, you know, of at least 6 inches at the bottom of the fence, all the way along, so that it's unlimited access, basically. But it should be fundamental in every garden. You know, there should be access. It should be mandatory that any garden, of course, in my eyes, any new build should have access for hedgehogs in and out, which, you know, I think is the biggest problem for them, or one of the biggest problems. Is we're now all going, you know, a lot of the fencing nowadays that's put up is concrete gravel boards at the bottom, which of course they've got no chance of getting through unless they can physically dig under it. But yeah, so definitely access is a big thing, and it's certainly something that I consider with every garden. And it's not so easy, of course, when people have got Jack Russells or something and they're going to whiz under the fence into the neighbour's garden. But where possible, definitely, every garden.
And you were talking earlier about just like the 10 acres of wildlife meadow, and that spanned over a number of gardens, and it quickly ratchets up. And the same holds true for as soon as you start linking up just what may be small gardens, but as soon as you provide those access holes through the fences, the total roaming area for hedgehogs, and let's be fair, it's not just hedgehogs, there's all kinds of wildlife that can then be able to access between these previously kind of fenced off and restricted gardens. That roaming area becomes absolutely massive, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, you know, things like wood mice, slowworms, grass snakes, they all need corridors to move along. They don't all have wings. You know, it's all right for dragonflies, damselflies, butterflies, and birds. But yeah, definitely by having these access points, it gives obviously opportunity for a lot more wildlife to enter and exit the garden. So yeah, certainly things like, you know, grass snakes, they do move a long way, and they often use corridors in terms of hedgerows. So if you've got a new build estate with an old hedgerow behind it, quite often they'll be going right the way along that hedgerow to move about. So, you know, having the holes in the fences obviously helps them massively.
Yeah. And where, in terms of kind of the concept of the wildlife garden, where does the hedgehog then actually fit in? Because I know there are all these different components in terms of, from the wildlife garden perspective, and the types of pots and the meadows and the ponds and that. But from the kind of fauna perspective, where does the hedgehog fit into a wildlife garden?
Well, I mean, it plays its part in obviously eating a lot of insects, which would therefore be munching back the you know, all the herbaceous stuff, which might be providing a larval food plant. So, you know, things such as, you know, garlic mustard, for example, in the garden, or honesty might have caterpillars on, such as, you know, the orange tip, green vein white, small white, large white, that sort of thing. So they are providing food for those insects, but then obviously the hedgehogs are going to enjoy a nice tasty snack if they come into the garden. So, but everything, you know, everything reaches an equilibrium eventually. You know, people might say, well, there's too many sparrowhawks visiting my garden. Well, you know, the chances are there's a lot of sparrowhawks visiting the garden, or usually it will just be a couple of individuals in that territory, because there's a plentiful source of food. So you have to think about it that way. You know, if there aren't any sparrowhawks there, you have to ask yourself why there aren't, because the birds aren't there. Well, why aren't the birds there? Because the cover and the food isn't there for the songbirds. So, you know, hedgehogs do certainly play a vital role. Yeah, and they're by no means going to be any detriment to a garden, that's for sure.
So we know, and it's well kind of publicized, and in fact you did one of the videos on behalf of Hedgehog Street about 10 things you could do in your garden, and it's things like providing the access and a log pile and that type of thing. But from a garden design perspective, so if you're going in to design the garden, are there any plants or shrubs or any components of the garden from that design perspective that you might consider, or that people may actually introduce into their gardens as being specifically attractive for hedgehogs, or somehow beneficial for hedgehogs, or providing something to a hedgehog?
Yeah, so one of the best things, I think, is to actually plant what I would call a coppice belt, which is something that I've been putting into gardens for a number of years now, and that is, in essence, a hedgerow, but with a slightly larger spacing on the shrubs. So you get less shrubs, so it's costing you less money. But equally, these shrubs are designed to then bush out, obviously, make a nice bushy specimen, and provide nectar and, you know, food in terms of berries, nuts, whatever it is, hazel, guelder rose, holly, spindle, that sort of thing. Provide a lot of food in terms of the nectar and the berries, but also larval food plants as well. So things like goat willow, obviously fantastic. Willows in general are very, very good for all the moth species, a lot of moth caterpillars associated with goat willow. And you may be thinking, well, what's all this got to do with hedgehogs? But the kind of the management of these coppice belts is to coppice them on a rotation. So whereas normally you'd have a hedge in your garden, you'd trim it, you know, once or twice a year to keep it a nice boxy shape. Well, that then doesn't get the chance to flower, because of course you're constantly cutting back the previous year's growth, which is of course where a lot of these plants will flower. Where the flowers will obviously develop. So by having a coppice belt and by managing it, so by cutting maybe 1 in every 3 or 1 in every 4 or 1 in every 5, depending on how long or how big you want the shrubs to get. If it's a standard back garden, probably, you know, cutting a third on rotation every year. So in the autumn time, literally cutting it down to what's known as a stool, or the coppice stump at the bottom, to letting it regenerate. That then provides dense cover for birds. It provides lots of fresh vegetation coming back for a lot of the larvae, a lot of the moths and butterflies to lay their eggs on. And it then obviously creates this continuous kind of regrowth, if you like, of all the vegetation. So you're never completely wiping out all your shrubs in your border. You've always got this successional regrowth. So a third 1 year, third second year, third and every 3 years. So, but equally that then gives them the time frame, at least 2 years, to then flower and produce fruit. So, you know, it's a win-win-win. But the final point I'm coming to, obviously all the byproducts of that coppicing works is some lovely brash, which is obviously very attractive to hedgehogs. So, you know, you can then have a continuous supply of what I would call brash, or the twiggy cuttings, which you can then stack the bottom of the garden, providing a really good hibernaculum for hedgehogs. So a coppice belt for me is really great, and of course all the insects associated with those coppice belts. It's great. All the leaf litter drops down underneath. It is just a fantastic habitat. I mean, I don't know if you've got much of an opinion on those actual specific habitats, Mike, but to me, I think they're one of the best things you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I've not got so much a kind of a coppice, the opportunity to do coppicing. I've got a couple of what are they, cherry laurels that have grown over a really long period of time and have now become really lovely big plants, and the hedgehogs do really like to go under there. And then I've got a lot of shrubs in terms of both evergreen and deciduous. So we get a lot of, come autumn time, those shrubs are all losing their leaves and that type of thing. But I've not done the, as you're saying, I think the closest I get to what you're describing is to cut back the buddleia that I've shaped a buddleia almost as a fence covering. So not the normal kind of buddleia clump that you might get, but I've actually shaped it in such a way that it covers a section of the fence. And then I do the similar type of thing to what you're saying, almost cut one or two, well, probably 1/3 of the upper growth down so that can regenerate. But you're right, that just produces lots of those long twiggy bits, especially on the buddleia. It produces very long individual stalks that you can then use and create the log pile and things like that. You're talking a lot about insects and all kinds of slug. You didn't say slugs, but insects and invertebrates, and they're just as important for hedgehogs. And actually not just hedgehogs, but if you've got a wildlife pond, the toads and frogs and that will also really enjoy. It is creating an ecosystem. You can't just create a wildlife garden thinking of one species alone, can you?
Not at all, no. And everything sort of comes hand in hand if you put together a few simple elements, which are your native trees and shrubs, your sort of herbaceous borders, which are obviously great for your pollinator pit stops, wildlife pond and a mini wildflower meadow. And with those main 4 elements, you're kind of ticking all the boxes, if you like. So as long as you've got somewhere in the garden that gets sun for a few hours of the day, you can have yourself a pond, which is obviously going to be the best thing, or one of the best things you can certainly put in your garden for wildlife. But they are an oasis. They really are a mini oasis. Yeah. If you just think of from the top down, from the trees, and they don't have to be huge trees, things such as rowan, crabapple. They're not massively big trees. They're going to be kind of medium height trees, which will go very well in a pretty small garden, but still attract a lot of wildlife, down to your shrub layers, down to your herbaceous perennials and your wildflowers. So you're almost creating this kind of woodland edge habitat, which is one of the most biodiverse habitats you can get in terms of just insect diversity and wildlife in general. Obviously, slowworms, grass snakes love to bask on the edge of vegetation where they can just slink away at the first sign of anybody coming near them. They love to get warm in the sun, of course. So, all this kind of cover is providing cover for so much stuff, and wood mice are fantastic climbers. So quite often you'll see them running actually through the shrubs themselves. So they're great to have in a garden. But just in general, it's about thinking about the bigger picture. The more wildlife you can fit into a garden, the more habitats you can fit into a garden, the more wildlife is going to be increased, and therefore everything else follows as well. It all starts with the insects. They are the basis. They're the bottom of the food chain, and without them, nothing else turns up. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that a lot of the things that you're describing, even from a kind of wildlife design perspective, are the things that if you looked up on the British Hedgehog Society page or you looked up on Hedgehog Street, they're the things that they're saying in terms of providing food, providing habitat, providing water. And you're kind of ticking the boxes in terms of the habitats, in terms of you're providing a natural source of food, which kind of has that's exactly what the hedgehog is going to eat, all those insects and invertebrates. And through the wildlife pond, you're providing a source of water one way or another, because they'll be attracted to that, won't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so you've probably seen the little time lapse of the wildlife pond I did last year on the channel, which It's phenomenal. It's over 1 million views on that now. It's just
that's your most popular. It's absolutely exploded, that one.
It just keeps giving that thing. But that pond itself, actually, the client emailed me 2 days after some photos of a pair of hedgehogs going down to drink from the pond. Literally, I think it was either the same night or the night after it had been installed. So absolutely, they are providing water. Hedgehogs need to drink as much as anything else. So a pond is just as good for hedgehogs as long as it has the shallow margins and it's not a death trap for them. You know, they can't drop in or they can drop in, but they're not get out, of course. So obviously, if you are creating a pond in your garden, think about access, think about how they get in and out. Hedgehogs, of course, are one of the biggest fatalities, I think, with wildlife ponds in terms of falling and not be able to get out. Of course, it's good to have vegetation on the edges, shallow sides, cobbles, rocks, stones, logs, anything you can in the water's edge, just so they can grab on, get a purchase and climb out. So yeah, ponds vital, but make sure they can get in and out okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to just, I had opened up the floor for questions, so to speak, in the week ahead of actually going live, and there were some questions specifically related to kind of maintaining the garden, which I think are relevant. Anne asked, when is the best time to trim hedges and shrubs so that you're not adversely affecting things like hedgehogs, birds, and bugs?
It's one of the worst questions in the world, this. I think I give a different answer every time. I think a lot of it depends on the nature of the hedge, but without kind of going into too many roundabout ways, I probably would say the best time is going to be. No, you see, I was going to say spring, but then of course you've got the flowers coming out. If it's hawthorn or something like that, you've obviously got the flowers coming out. If it's autumn, of course, you're going to trim off all the berries for your song thrush, your blackbird, your redbirds, your fieldfare. And of course, if it's ivy, if it's got ivy in it, if you're trimming in the autumn, then you're knocking out a huge supply of nectar for your red admirals and wasps and things later on in October. So very, very tricky trimming hedges. And of course, depends on the species, but generally things like hawthorn is one of the most species-rich shrubs you can get in the UK. So you trim that in the spring, in the summer, for example, when it's got lots of growth on it. You're trimming off that growth that's then going to be producing the flowers the season after. So very difficult. I mean, I would say if you had to, I would trim a kind of March time before everything gets going, and then that way you still have time for things to grow back and then flower. You know, if you start trimming in May time, everything's in flowers, pandemonium. But I would say early spring, end of February, once all the berries are gone, is probably the best time, I would say, to that one.
Great. Another one, Jane has asked, what can I advise my neighbors to use instead of slug pellets? So some kind of replacement for slug pellets, because we know that introducing poisons into that ecosystem, into that food chain, not only impacts the slugs that we may be trying to get rid of as gardeners, but actually it just goes up the food chain, doesn't it, and impacts so many other species. So what can we, and I suppose it's not just slug pellets and focused on slugs, what can we use? What are some of the things we can do instead of introducing poisons or pesticides into the garden?
Buy a few song thrushes. I'm not advocating selling birds, by the way. But generally, natural defenses. Obviously, slug pellets, huge no. You just, I don't understand how slug pellets are even, available in this day and age. They just go up the food and they kill. They'll start with the hedgehogs, then they might go into badgers if a badger eats one, or they might go into the bugs, then into the birds. They might go then into the sparrowhawks, which might go then into a fox. It's just. Yeah, I know everybody watching this is obviously going to be against slug pellets, but it's just natural ways of reducing the numbers. I mean, I must admit, I love snails to bits, but my God, the garden is prolific with them. I could do with about 20 hedgehogs and about 15 song thrushes, and of course song thrushes. I mean, how massive they're red listed now. Wonderful bird. I used to see them so much, even 25 years ago. Used to love watching them in the garden, just thrashing away at a snail, and just knocking the shell off it. But you just don't see as many as you used to. So the best way you can attract more song thrushes and blackbirds as well, things like that, to your garden is to obviously provide cover provide nesting potential for them. So some dense growth, things such as pyracantha is obviously very good for blackbirds, robins, dunnocks, song thrushes. So attract the birds in, provide autumn food for them, provide berries. So things such as a rowan tree, obviously fabulous, probably the best tree you could put in your garden if you've got a small garden. Rowans, the berries in the autumn are going to attract the thrush species in. But just providing cover for birds in general. Birds will only be in a garden if there is cover. If people put a bird feeder in the middle of a lawn and then wonder why there's nothing visiting, well, they're open to predation from sparrowhawks, so they need the cover. So I digress slightly, but it is relevant. The main predators for the slugs and the snails is going to be a lot of the bird species, obviously, and slow worms as well. I mean, I forget about slow worms. Slow worms actually eat a lot of slugs. They are a big part of their diet. So again, by providing brash piles, which in turn will encourage the hedgehogs and the slow worms, you're providing another weapon to your arsenal in terms of the fighting the wildlife crime that these slugs and snails are committing.
Absolutely.
Provide cover for the slow worms and the hedgehogs, and that way hopefully that will lessen the population, all being well.
Yep. Heather's asked probably a pertinent question. You mentioned earlier about, you've mentioned all kinds of different animals, but in terms of insects, in terms of bees seem to have been particularly or potentially impacted by a cold spring, and that's potentially been quite disastrous for them. How can we best help the bees in our gardens is the question that I'm eventually getting to.
Well, obviously, depending on the type of bee, of course, things like mining bees. Well, a lot of bees actually will nest underground. So by having some areas of shorter grass and longer grass as well, but shorter grass as well, that you're not kind of trampling on all the time, will enable them to get some nests underground. But in general, I think that the thing to do is, of course, because, as I said earlier, my honesty that still isn't in flower yet has been knocked back along with so many other species of wildflower this year, even if it's just by a couple of weeks. A couple of weeks is a long time when you're a hungry bee. So the best thing you can do is provide early nectar sources for these bees. So, things such as snowdrops. Snowdrops, obviously, I think I did my snowdrop video back at the end of January, early February when they're in flower, and I even saw honeybees using them then. So, snowdrops, things like that. You've got things like pulmonaria or lungwort, which is obviously another good one. Primroses, just fantastic flower, really are just incredible. Cowslips, all this sort of thing that you've been seeing for the last few weeks now. You're providing early nectar for them, cuckoo flower as well, obviously. That's going to help them through the colder time. So the earlier flowering stuff you can get. And one thing I've noticed as well that is really, really good for bees is the stinking hellebore, the native hellebore found in the UK. It's not completely repulsive. You don't put some in the garden and then never want to go in it again. It's got these little kind of pendunculate green, lime green flowers. I love it. It's a fantastic plant.
Yeah.
Stinking hellebore, really, really good for early bumblebees and hairy-footed flower bees, that sort of thing in the garden. So they are really good for that. So yes, as much early nectar as you can, I think, because bees, they're pretty much, well, there's very, very few years where bees aren't seen every month of the year. So unless we get a really, really cold snap, they'll be out in surprisingly cool conditions.
So there's a lot. I mean, just hearing you talk thinking about
as well. So
go on.
Shrubs. Well, I know I said early flower, but things like forsythia, as well, winter flowering jasmine, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Mahonia as well. Obviously, they've been and gone, seems like ages ago now. So, these all got yellow flowers, funnily enough. But, yeah, they are good shrubs as well. So it's not just your herbaceous stuff. You can think bigger, you can think shrubs, and that will help them as well, definitely. And you can get even some winter flowering hebes, winter flowering heather. So much that you can put in your garden for them, definitely. Sorry, I interrupted, but just kind of shrubs came into my head.
No, it's absolutely fine, because I was just thinking the amount of kind of thought and that goes into the design when you're thinking of it's not just the aesthetic, it's thinking of making sure that there are food sources for your insects and your pollinating bees and things like that throughout the year, and making sure that you've got that variety, not just flowers in spring or beautiful flowers at the end of summer. It's having a food source for the bees and other insects throughout the year, isn't it?
Definitely. Yeah, no, that's absolutely the point. Right the way into autumn, of course, when you've got things like speckled wood butterflies, small tortoise shells, not peacocks, sorry, they've gone into hibernation by then, but red admirals, they're all going to be on the wing, even into October, early October sometimes. So, ivy, for example, letting that flower, not trimming that back every year. Ivy is fantastic, and then of course provides the berries for a lot of other wildlife as well, as alongside being the larval food plant of the holly blue butterfly in their second brood in the autumn as well. So providing that extended period of things such as sedums, for example, sedum, autumn, that sort of stuff, it's really going to provide a late flowering nectar for a lot of these insects. And cutting buddleias back later as well. Once the buddleias have flowered, deadhead them, take all the dead heads off, and then they'll of course keep going later and later into the season, providing an extended period of nectar as well. Yeah,
and they're really good. Well, it's a butterfly bush, so they would be really good for butterflies, but other pollinators as well, wouldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of moth species use them as well.
Yeah.
And moths, we forget about the ones we don't see when the sun goes down.
Exactly.
2,500 species of moth in the UK, which is many times more than there are butterflies. And obviously they're doing just as big a part, and obviously a much bigger percentage in terms of pollinating a lot of these flowers. So, just because we're all tucked up in bed doesn't mean that the pollination isn't still going on.
Yeah. No, absolutely. There's a couple of questions specifically about hedgehogs, and maybe a good time to ask you, do you, within your wildlife garden, do you have visiting hedgehogs?
I do, yes. And I saw the first one for a long time, actually, it was the back end of last year. And I just literally opened the back door to take something out to the recycling bin. And there it was, snuffling its way past, and I was just like, well, pretty much cartwheeling down the garden, It was just wonderful to see, and it sort of snuffled off into the undergrowth, and they went. I suspect there's quite a few that are down the bottom of the garden, because I have got massive piles of brash, the herbaceous borders rammed with everything, and it just, there's so many insects in the garden, it's just phenomenal. But absolutely delighted. See, that was really great.
Brilliant. Linda just asked, with respect to hedgehogs, she has 3 visiting hedgehogs, but noticed that they then were there at one point and then didn't return, and she's wondering whether the scuffling behavior, the pushing and the shoving, which is common for hedgehogs, may have put them off and kind of scared them off. Linda absolutely can tell you, not at all. My experience is that they tend to roll each other around the flower beds, and then they all scurry off for the evening, and they'll come back again. It may not be the next night. I seem to have kind of a cycle of about 7 that come through the garden one at a time each night, and they do cycle around. So I can assure you that they haven't been scared off, and keep providing the food, and they will be back. Sue, good evening to you. She says she's got a cat and will this put hedgehogs off. I don't know if you've got a cat, Joel. I've got 2 who are exceptionally curious about the hedgehogs, but it's neither put the hedgehogs off the cats or the cats off the hedgehogs. So Sue, I don't think you've got anything to worry about there. Do you have other pets?
I have 3 rather large dogs. One of them is a He's a Malamute crossed with a German Shepherd, and he has once, on one occasion, been found actually rolling a hedgehog up the side passage of the house with his nose, yelping all the way, which it didn't put them off. They still then came out of the shell and carried on. It was a bit of an odd thing to see, but yeah, I think dogs, cats. To be honest, I don't think hedgehogs are much put off by them. They're pretty bolshy when they want to be. Badgers,
yeah.
however, obviously can be a little bit off-putting, being a predator of theirs. However, I've seen some incredible footage over the last year. One or two people that I know who've shown me video of badgers and hedgehogs eating and drinking out of the same bowl on a lawn, which is just very odd. But then, that is probably a consequence of there being plenty of food for a badger. I don't think that badgers just go out on a beeline for hedgehogs every night. I think, if the food sources are there, of course, a lot of their diet will be worms, and beetles and insects and everything else, the same as hedgehogs. But I think, it's when times get harsh, perhaps if they're, in a bit of a, back where I grew up in Lincolnshire in the fenland landscapes, badgers are, you quite often find these isolated sets in the middle of a very small copse surrounded by arable land, in which case, food is going to be limited. So they are naturally going to eat whatever they can find. They are scavengers, just like corvids, just like foxes. They're opportunists. These things have to survive. So if there's a hedgehog trundling along their path, unfortunately, that then becomes the next meal. But I think where food is plentiful, particularly in towns, cities, I would imagine. I don't know if you're aware of any surveys, Mike, but I would imagine that hedgehogs being predated by badgers is certainly a lot less.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. It's that rivalry for food, or the availability of food. And I've seen similar where people have got these massive gardens, and deer and badgers and foxes and hedgehogs all seem to eat around the same trough, just because the availability of food makes the competitiveness and the rivalry not so bad. Joel, I am incredibly conscious of the fact that you're probably exceptionally busy, and I'm taking up your time, and I'm under strict instruction to get you back to your chores, because I believe the gardening shop is requiring some plants to be done. I think you did something like 1,500, or was it 15,000 seeds last night, and you plan to do the same?
I've been sowing. So I've got another batch. I sowed 1,500 wildflowers 2 nights back. I've got another 1,500 to sow. Then that's this specific greenhouse maxed out, just to try and keep up with demand. Just to try and provide a lot more wildflowers for everybody, of course, to put in their own garden. So I'm not about to go outside now and try and start sowing those in the twilight. But yes, no, just lots on at the moment. Just lots of quotes and planning, and we've got about 4 jobs on the go at the moment, and several teams of guys. So it's very time consuming from dawn till dusk at the minute, but it's great that there's more habitats being created, and of course
absolutely,
now is the time of year everybody's wanting to get in the garden and get on with it. It's
absolutely
always the biggest time.
Absolutely. Well, Joel, I am incredibly grateful for you taking the time and spending the time here on Hedgehog Solo. I'm really appreciative. I appreciate it's your busiest time of the year practically, and for you to give up this time, I'm very, very grateful. And thank you for coming along and sharing your insights. It's absolutely brilliant. I will leave links to the book, to the website, and also to your various online presences. You've got Twitter, Instagram, as well as the YouTube channel, which is absolutely flying, doing incredibly well. Joel, the work that you're doing is brilliant. Thank you so much, and thank you very much for coming and spending your time with me this evening.
No, you're very welcome. It's an absolute pleasure. It's nice to finally meet you, in inverted commas. I know we've been for a little while, and passing comments now and again, but it's the same with everything. There's so many people that I've got to know across, particularly YouTube, but also Twitter and Instagram as well, and it's nice to actually meet you, and I can't wait to get out and get doing some talks again. You know, I've got a huge withdrawal. You know, I've done a lot of online Zoom things to 20, 30 people, but you know, actually seeing people face to face, I think is a much better experience. I much prefer it. So I'm very much looking forward to when we can do that again. But only if you're short. I mean, hey, come on, Mike, don't say yourself short. We've got 5 minutes left here. If you if you've got any more questions, happy to take them. Or if you've got anything else, then yeah, feel free.
No, I'm just checking if there are any more questions that are coming in. There's been none on the form, and there's nothing at the moment. But people are very appreciative of your time, saying all kinds of very grateful, thankful things. So again, I can only echo those comments. Joel, thank you so much. It's incredibly interesting to hear what you're doing, but also just the thinking that goes into these kinds of wildlife gardens is incredible. And thank you so much. I mean, 10 acres of wild meadow, coupled with all the rest, the number of ponds you must have done and created, and just those creating those different habitats is brilliant.
So that should be I'll let you know when I meet the century on the wildlife ponds. That's I can't remember what number one now, 93 or 94 or something. So it won't be long. It'll be this year. I guarantee you that.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, all the best, and all the best for all the different endeavors. And like I say, there'll be links to all the information and how to get hold of Joel or find Joel online in the video description. Joel, again, thank you so much. So very grateful. And please say thank you to your family, who you've also left for an hour to spend with us. So I'm very grateful. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Yeah. See you soon. Thanks, Mike.
Take care. Cheers.
Bye-bye. Cheers.